Karen Weston was fuming as she stared out the window of her immaculate suburban home. Her perfectly manicured brows were furrowed in a scowl, and her perfectly glossed lips were pressed into a thin line. The source of her anger? Her neighbor, Samantha, had the audacity to park her car in front of Karen's mailbox. The nerve of that woman. Karen muttered under her breath. Doesn't she know that's my spot? You see, Karen was the type of person who believed the world revolved around her. She expected everyone to cater to her every whim and demand, and heaven forbid anyone dare to cross her. Samantha's transgression was just the latest in a long line of offenses that had been piling up in Karen's mind. Determined to teach Samantha a lesson, Karen marched outside, her designer heels clacking against the pristine pavement. She approached Samantha's car, a smug grin playing on her lips. "Excuse me, but you're blocking my mailbox," Karen said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Samantha, a kind-hearted young woman who had recently moved into the neighborhood, looked up from her phone, startled. "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize. Let me move my car right away." But Karen held up a perfectly manicured hand. No, that won't be necessary. I'll take care of it myself." Before Samantha could react, Karen was already behind the wheel of her own car, backing it up until it was perfectly positioned in front of Samantha's. Then, with a triumphant flourish, she turned off the engine and stepped out, leaving Samantha's car trapped. "There, that should teach you a lesson about respecting your neighbors," Karen said, her eyes glinting with satisfaction. Samantha stood there, dumbfounded, her mouth agape. She couldn't believe what was happening. But I need to get to work. I have an important meeting this morning." Karen waved a dismissive hand. "That's not my problem, dear. Maybe next time you'll think twice before blocking someone's mailbox." With that, Karen turned on her heel and strutted back to her house, leaving Samantha stranded and fuming. Little did she know, however, that her actions were about to have some unexpected consequences. As Samantha stood there, frantically trying to figure out what to do, a police car suddenly pulled up. The officer stepped out, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Ma'am, is there a problem here?" he asked, eyeing the two cars blocking the mailbox. Samantha quickly explained the situation, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. "Officer, my neighbor, Karen, blocked me in because I accidentally parked in front of her mailbox. I need to get to work, and she won't let me leave." The officer's expression darkened, and he turned to Karen's car, which was still blocking the mailbox. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to move your vehicle immediately. You're obstructing a mailbox, which is a federal offense." Karen, who had been watching the proceedings from her window, emerged with a haughty expression. "Officer, I was simply trying to teach my neighbor a lesson about respecting other people's property. Surely you can understand that." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Ma'am, I'm afraid I don't care about your personal disputes. You're in violation of the law, and I'm going to have to issue you a citation. And if you don't move your car right now, I'll have it towed." Karen's face paled, and her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She had never been on the receiving end of such consequences before, and she was utterly unprepared for it. Reluctantly, she got back into her car and moved it, allowing Samantha to finally leave for work. As the police officer wrote out the citation, Karen fumed silently, realizing that her attempt to teach a lesson had backfired spectacularly. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of her troubles. As Karen stewed in the aftermath of her disastrous encounter with the police, she couldn't shake the burning feeling of humiliation and anger. How dare that officer treat her like a common criminal? Didn't he know who she was? Karen fumed as she paced around her immaculate living room, her finely manicured nails digging into the palms of her hands. She had always been the queen of her little suburban kingdom, and she wasn't about to let some upstart neighbor and a lowly police officer take that away from her. "This means war," she muttered under her breath, her eyes narrowing with determination. Over the next few days, Karen went out of her way to make Samantha's life a living hell. She would park her car in front of Samantha's driveway, blocking her in. She would complain to the homeowners association about the unsightly lawn ornaments in Samantha's yard. She even went so far as to call the city and report a suspicious person in the neighborhood, which resulted in Samantha being questioned by the police. Samantha, for her part, tried to remain calm and composed, but the constant harassment was taking its toll. She felt like she was walking on eggshells in her own home, always afraid of what Karen might do next. One day, as Samantha was bringing in her groceries, she noticed that her mailbox had been vandalized. The red flag had been snapped off, and the door was hanging open, her mail strewn across the ground. Samantha's heart sank as she realized that Karen must have been behind this latest act of petty retaliation. She quickly gathered up her mail and rushed inside, her hands shaking with a mix of anger and fear. That evening, as Samantha sat at her kitchen table, staring at the damaged mailbox, she made a decision. She was going to fight back, but she was going to do it the right way, through the proper channels. The next day, Samantha marched down to the local police station, her head held high. She filed a formal complaint against Karen, detailing all of the harassment and vandalism she had endured. The officer on duty listened intently, his brow furrowed with concern. "This is a serious matter, ma'am," he said, his voice grave. "We take these kinds of cases very seriously. I'll make sure our detectives investigate this thoroughly." Samantha felt a sense of relief wash over her. Finally, someone was taking her seriously. She knew that Karen's reign of terror couldn't last forever, and with the police on her side, she felt a renewed sense of hope. Little did she know, however, that Karen was about to up the ante in a way that would leave everyone in the neighborhood stunned. As Samantha settled in for the night, her phone suddenly rang. It was her next-door neighbor, and the panic in her voice was palpable. "Samantha, you need to come outside right away. Something terrible has happened." Samantha's heart raced as she rushed out the door, her mind racing with 1,000 different scenarios. What could have possibly happened that was so urgent? The sight that greeted her left her speechless. There, in the middle of the street, was Karen's car, up on blocks, with all 4 tires missing. Samantha stared at the scene in disbelief, her mouth hanging open. She couldn't believe her eyes. Karen had always been a force to be reckoned with, but this was a whole new level of insanity. As the neighbors gathered around, whispering and shaking their heads, Samantha realized that the stakes had just been raised. This was no longer just a petty dispute between 2 neighbors, it was a full-blown war, and she was determined to win. As the news of Karen's vandalized car spread through the neighborhood, the residents were torn between shock, amusement, and a growing sense of unease. While many secretly relished the thought of someone finally putting Karen in her place, the escalating nature of the feud had everyone on edge. Samantha, in particular, was both relieved and deeply unsettled by the latest development. On one hand, she felt a sense of vindication. Karen was finally facing the consequences of her entitled and abusive behavior. But on the other hand, she couldn't help but worry about where this conflict would lead next. The police arrived promptly, their sirens blaring, and began to canvass the area for clues. Karen, who had been frantically pacing in front of her house, rushed over to the officers, her face flushed with rage. "Officers, I demand that you find the culprit and bring them to justice," she shrieked, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the palms of her hands. The lead officer, a seasoned veteran who had dealt with his fair share of irate Karens, regarded her with a cool, impassive stare. "Ma'am, we're investigating this incident thoroughly, but we'll need your cooperation. Can you tell us if you've noticed anyone acting suspiciously in the neighborhood recently?" Karen's eyes narrowed, and she shot a pointed glare in Samantha's direction. "As a matter of fact, officer, my neighbor Samantha has been harassing me for weeks. I suspect she's the one behind this despicable act of vandalism." Samantha, who had been standing nearby, felt her heart skip a beat. She had been prepared for Karen's retaliation, but this was a new low, even for her. Stepping forward, she addressed the officer in a calm, measured tone. "Officer, I can assure you that I had nothing to do with this. In fact, I've been the one filing complaints against Karen for her ongoing harassment and vandalism of my property. I'm just as shocked and appalled by this as you are." The officer nodded, his brow furrowed in thought. "I see. Well, we'll need to investigate both of your claims thoroughly before we can determine the culprit. In the meantime, I'd advise you both to avoid any further escalation of this conflict." As the officers continued their investigation, the tension in the air was palpable. Karen glared at Samantha with undisguised hatred, while Samantha tried to maintain a composed, professional demeanor. Later that evening, as Samantha was preparing dinner, her phone rang. It was the police officer, his voice grave. "Miss Samantha, I'm afraid I have some troubling news. We've discovered that the vandalism to Karen's car was not an isolated incident. Several of your other neighbors have reported similar acts of vandalism to their property, all seemingly targeting those who are friendly with you." Samantha felt her stomach drop. "What? But I haven't done anything. Are you saying that Karen is—" "I'm afraid so," the officer interrupted. "The evidence points to your neighbor, Karen, as the one responsible for these acts of retaliation. We're issuing a warrant for her arrest as we speak." Samantha couldn't believe what she was hearing. Karen had truly taken this feud to a whole new level, and the consequences were starting to ripple throughout the entire neighborhood. She knew that this was far from over, and that the next move would be hers. As she hung up the phone, Samantha steeled herself for the confrontation that was inevitably to come. She was determined to put an end to Karen's reign of terror, once and for all. As the news of Karen's arrest warrant spread through the neighborhood, a palpable sense of relief and cautious optimism began to take hold. For years, the residents had endured Karen's entitled and abusive behavior, but now, finally, it seemed that justice was about to be served. Samantha, in particular, felt a weight lift from her shoulders. No longer would she have to constantly look over her shoulder, wondering what new scheme Karen had cooked up to torment her. She could finally start to reclaim her peace of mind and enjoy the simple pleasures of her home. But as the police investigation unfolded, an even more sinister truth began to emerge. Karen's campaign of harassment and vandalism had been far more widespread than anyone could have imagined. The officers had uncovered evidence that Karen had been systematically targeting not just Samantha, but several other neighbors who she perceived as threats to her social standing or who had simply failed to cater to her whims. From slashing tires to vandalizing property, Karen had gone to great lengths to assert her dominance and punish those who dared to cross her. Samantha's heart sank as she learned the full extent of Karen's misdeeds. She had known that her neighbor was capable of pettiness and vindictiveness, but the sheer scale of her cruelty was truly staggering. As the police prepared to execute the arrest warrant, Samantha decided to take matters into her own hands. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than met the eye, and she was determined to get to the bottom of it. Gathering her courage, Samantha knocked on Karen's door, fully expecting to be met with a tirade of insults and accusations. But to her surprise, Karen answered the door with a surprisingly calm and composed demeanor. "Samantha, what a pleasant surprise," Karen said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "To what do I owe this honor?" Samantha took a deep breath, steeling herself for the confrontation. "Karen, I know what you've been doing. The police have a warrant for your arrest, and they're on their way here as we speak." Karen's eyes widened for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "I have no idea what you're talking about, dear. I'm simply a law-abiding citizen who has been the victim of a series of unfortunate incidents." Samantha shook her head, unwilling to be cowed by Karen's bravado. "Don't play dumb with me, Karen. We both know that you've been behind all of the vandalism and harassment in the neighborhood. The police have the evidence to prove it." Karen's lips curled into a sneer. "Evidence? What evidence? I'm sure I have no idea what you're talking about. Perhaps you've been watching too many crime dramas, my dear. But Samantha wasn't about to back down. I know you, Karen. You've always been obsessed with maintaining your perfect image and keeping everyone in line. But this time, you've gone too far. The jade is up, and you're going to pay for what you've done. Just then, the sound of sirens pierced the air, and Samantha could see the flashing lights of the police cars approaching. Karen's face paled, and for the first time, Samantha saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. As the officers swarmed the scene, Karen tried one last desperate attempt to maintain her innocence. But the weight of the evidence was simply too much to bear, and she was swiftly led away in handcuffs, her shrieks of protest echoing through the neighborhood. Samantha watched the spectacle with a mixture of relief and trepidation. While she was grateful to see Karen finally face the consequences of her actions, she couldn't help but wonder what other secrets the woman might be hiding. She knew that this was far from the end of the story, and that the true reckoning was yet to come. As the news of Karen's arrest spread through the neighborhood, a collective sigh of relief could be felt among the residents. For years, they had endured her entitled behavior and petty acts of retaliation, and now, finally, she was being held accountable for her actions. Samantha, in particular, felt a sense of vindication. She had always known that Karen was capable of terrible things, but the extent of her scheming and cruelty had still managed to shock her. The fact that the woman had been systematically targeting and terrorizing her neighbors simply for not catering to her whims was both infuriating and deeply unsettling. As the police investigation continued, more and more details began to emerge about the depth of Karen's misdeeds. It turned out that she had been carefully orchestrating an elaborate web of lies and manipulation, using her status and influence within the community to cover her tracks. From false reports to the Homeowners Association to anonymous calls to the police, Karen had left no stone unturned in her quest to maintain her grip on the neighborhood. She had even gone so far as to bribe a local handyman to carry out some of the more egregious acts of vandalism, all in an effort to throw the authorities off her trail. Samantha couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the sheer audacity of Karen's scheme. The woman had clearly gone to great lengths to ensure that her reign of terror would continue uninterrupted, and it was only by pure chance that her plan had ultimately unraveled. As the investigation continued, the police uncovered even more damning evidence against Karen. They discovered that she had been using her position on the Homeowners Association to target specific residents, funneling funds into a slush account to finance her twisted vendetta. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community, as neighbors who had once blindly trusted Karen's leadership suddenly found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew about her. Samantha, meanwhile, watched the unfolding drama with a mix of emotions. She was relieved that the truth was finally coming to light, but she also couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness for the community that had been so badly betrayed. "It's just heartbreaking, you know," she confided to one of her neighbors. "We all trusted Karen, and she just used that trust to hurt us. It's a betrayal on a whole other level." The neighbor nodded solemnly, their eyes filled with a mixture of anger and disappointment. "You're right, Samantha. This is going to take a long time to heal from. But at least now we know the truth, and we can start to move forward." As the police continued to build their case against Karen, the residents of the neighborhood began to come together in a way they hadn't done in years. Neighbors who had once been at odds with one another started to reach out, united in their shared experience of Karen's manipulation and abuse. Samantha, for her part, found herself at the center of this newfound sense of community. Her willingness to stand up to Karen and her dogged pursuit of the truth had earned her the respect and admiration of her fellow residents. And as the trial date drew nearer, Samantha couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. She knew that the road ahead would be a long and difficult one, but she was more determined than ever to see this through to the end. Karen's reign of terror was finally coming to a close, and Samantha was determined to make sure that justice was served. As the trial date for Karen's case approached, The entire neighborhood was buzzing with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. After years of enduring her entitled behavior and relentless acts of retaliation, the residents were eager to see justice served. But they also couldn't help but feel a sense of unease, knowing that the outcome of the trial could have far-reaching consequences for the community. Samantha, who had been at the forefront of the investigation, found herself thrust into the spotlight. She had become a symbol of resistance against Karen's tyrannical rule, and the weight of that responsibility weighed heavily on her shoulders. As she sat in the courtroom, surrounded by her neighbors and a sea of reporters, Samantha couldn't help but feel a surge of adrenaline. This was her moment to finally stand up to the woman who had tormented her and so many others, and she was determined to make the most of it. The prosecution's case was damning, with a mountain of evidence that painted a clear picture of Karen's calculated campaign of harassment and manipulation. From the vandalized mailboxes to the fraudulent homeowners association reports, the jury was presented with a compelling narrative that left little doubt about the defendant's guilt. But Karen, ever the consummate performer, refused to go down without a fight. She took the stand, her perfectly coiffed hair and impeccable makeup a stark contrast to the gravity of the situation. With a theatrical flourish, she wove a convoluted tale of lies and half-truths, trying to paint herself as the victim of a neighborhood-wide conspiracy. Samantha watched in disbelief as Karen spun her web of deceit, her stomach churning with a mixture of anger and disgust. How dare this woman continue to manipulate and deceive, even in the face of overwhelming evidence? But as the trial wore on, it became clear that Karen's theatrics were failing to sway the jury. The more she tried to deflect and obfuscate, the more her credibility crumbled. The residents of the neighborhood, who had once been cowed by her intimidation tactics, now sat in the gallery, their faces etched with a newfound resolve. Finally, after days of testimony and cross-examination, the jury reached its verdict. Karen was found guilty on all counts, her carefully constructed facade of respectability shattered beyond repair. As the judge handed down her sentence, the courtroom erupted in a wave of cheers and applause. Samantha, who had been sitting quietly in the front row, felt a sense of relief wash over her. After so many years of torment, the nightmare was finally over. But as she walked out of the courtroom, surrounded by her newfound allies, Samantha couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness. The community she had once known had been irrevocably changed by Karen's actions, and it would take time and effort to heal the wounds she had inflicted. Yet, there was also a sense of hope in the air. The residents had banded together, united in their determination to never again allow someone like Karen to hold them hostage. They had reclaimed their power, and in doing so, had forged a bond that would be difficult to break. As Samantha looked around at the faces of her neighbors, she couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. This was their moment of triumph, a testament to the power of community and the unwavering spirit of those who refuse to be cowed by the entitled and the abusive. And as for Karen, well, her downfall had been swift and decisive. The once untouchable queen of the neighborhood had been dethroned, her legacy forever tarnished by her own hubris and cruelty. In the wake of Karen's conviction, the neighborhood underwent a profound transformation. The once fractured community had been forged anew, united by a shared experience of trauma and triumph. Samantha, who had emerged as the unlikely heroine of the saga, found herself at the center of this newfound sense of camaraderie. Her neighbors, once wary and distrustful, now regarded her with a newfound respect and admiration. As the dust settled, the residents began to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, taking stock of the damage that Karen's reign of terror had wrought. Homes had been vandalized, relationships had been strained, and a pervasive sense of unease had seeped into the very fabric of the community. But instead of succumbing to despair, the residents banded together, determined to rebuild and reclaim what they had lost. Neighborhood watch groups were formed, security systems were installed, and a renewed sense of vigilance permeated the air. Samantha, for her part, found herself at the forefront of this collective effort. She had always been a quiet and unassuming neighbor, but the events of the past year had transformed her into a fiercely protective advocate for her community. As the trial proceedings came to a close and Karen was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, Samantha couldn't help but feel a sense of relief tinged with a hint of regret. She knew that the woman's downfall was ultimately a tragedy, not just for her, but for the entire neighborhood. It's a bittersweet victory, you know. Samantha confided to one of her closest friends. I'm glad that Karen is finally being held accountable for her actions, but I can't help but wonder how it all went so wrong. We were once a close-knit community, and now we're left to pick up the pieces of the damage she's caused. Her friend nodded, understanding the complexity of the situation. I know, Samantha. But at least now we have the chance to rebuild, to create something even stronger than what we had before. Karen may have taken a lot from us, but she couldn't take away our resilience and our determination to stand up for one another. Samantha couldn't help but agree. As she looked around at the neighbors who had once been divided, she saw a newfound sense of unity and purpose. They were no longer just individuals living side by side, but a true community bound by a shared experience and a collective resolve to never again allow someone like Karen to hold them hostage. In the months that followed, the neighborhood embarked on a series of initiatives aimed at healing the wounds that Karen had inflicted. Block parties were organized, community gardens were planted, and a sense of neighborly camaraderie began to permeate the air once more. Samantha, who had once been an outsider, found herself at the center of this revitalization effort. Her neighbors, once wary of her, now sought her counsel and guidance, recognizing her as a voice of reason and resilience in a world that had been turned upside down. And as for Karen, well, her legacy in the neighborhood had been forever tarnished. Her name had become synonymous with the very worst of human nature, a cautionary tale of the dangers of unchecked entitlement and abuse of power. But for Samantha and her fellow residents, the true triumph lay not in Karen's downfall, but in the strength and unity they had forged in the face of adversity. They had reclaimed their power, and in doing so, had made the community stronger than ever before. As the months passed and the wounds of the Karen debacle began to heal, the residents of the once divided neighborhood found themselves embarking on a new chapter. The trauma they had endured had forged an unbreakable bond between them, and they were determined to use that strength to build something even greater. Samantha, who had been at the heart of the struggle, found herself at the forefront of this newfound community spirit. Her neighbors, once wary and distrustful, now looked to her as a symbol of hope and resilience. Together, they set out to reclaim their shared spaces, organizing block parties, community gardens, and neighborhood watch programs. The once pristine lawns and manicured hedges now bore the vibrant colors of wildflowers and the laughter of children at play. It was a remarkable transformation, one that had been born out of the ashes of Karen's reign of terror. Where there had once been fear and division, there was now a palpable sense of unity and purpose. As Samantha walked the streets of her newly revitalized neighborhood, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and accomplishment. The battle had been long and hard fought, but in the end, they had emerged victorious. But even as she reveled in this newfound sense of community, Samantha couldn't help but wonder about the fate of her former neighbor, Karen. The woman had been sentenced to a lengthy prison term, a just punishment for the harm she had inflicted upon the community. Yet, Samantha couldn't help but feel a twinge of empathy for her. Underneath the veneer of entitlement and cruelty, there had been a deeply troubled individual, one who had been shaped by a lifetime of privilege and a profound lack of empathy. As she contemplated the complexities of the situation, Samantha realized that true healing could only come through understanding and forgiveness. It was a lesson that had been hard won, but one that would ultimately serve as the foundation for a brighter future. And so, with a renewed sense of purpose, Samantha set out to lead her community into this new era. They would rebuild, they would heal, and they would emerge stronger than ever before. For in the end, the story of Karen's downfall was not just about the triumph of the underdog, but about the power of a community to come together and overcome even the most daunting of challenges. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, and a reminder that no matter how dark the night, the dawn will always break.